So today, I think we can talk about the situation of globalism after the financial crisis of 2008, and give some remarks on that. Give some remarks on that shortly. Should all of you have your book reviews back by now? Those of you who haven't managed to do one and still intend to do it, these are special circumstances, but please get in touch with me about it and give me an indication of your situation. Um, I'm hoping you'll finish up reading Friedman and also finish up reading in Stone and try to get a kind of a general impression about where their arguments are going. Next time I'll talk about Friedman's argument in general and a sort of a long wave theory that historians might use in order to describe the phenomenon of globalization at the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st. A long wave theory that I think you can sort of see developing. It's more or less outlined by Friedman. I want to give my version of it next time and sort of give some world history generalizations about globalization as nearly as we can tell from the present circumstances. Okay, and also we might ask the question whether globalization is all over. That's something you see in the press and has more or less a consensus, I think, among the most sophisticated media that the era of globalization is really reaching an end, or at any rate, it's so threadbare now that we have to come up with some major stratagem in order to continue thinking in terms of globalization. But they don't say what we're supposed to think in terms of, that is to say, what the alternative to globalization is. So anyhow, I'll take up some of those questions next time. And Thursday, maybe let's have a Zoom session and let's talk about the final. I want to get an idea of what would be a good thing to ask for questions on the final. And I'm going to ask quite a few questions on the final. Rather than just one, as we did for the midterm, I'll give you two choices, or I should say I'll give you two essays to write. You'll be writing two rather than one, as you did for the midterm. You'll be writing two, and within those two, there'll be a choice. So there'll be quite a few questions, maybe 5 or 6 different questions that I can ask as prompts for the final. And I'm going to want to discuss what you want to write on, what you think you can write on, all the rest of that. I want to discuss some of that on Thursday when we have a Zoom session. So let's talk today about neoglobalism. This is a coinage of my own, neoglobalism, after the crisis of 2008. I guess the first thing you might say about it, or first thing I would say about it, is that the whole globalism model, the idea of the inevitability of globalism, the historical, how to put it, necessity of globalism, the logic of it, the political principles of it, or not the political, but the political economy, economic principles of, the iron laws of international economics as Friedman lays them out when he's talking about the 19th century and the British precursor to globalism, that all those ideas seem to be, in my opinion, exposed by the crisis of 2008. I guess one has to say that the very basis, all of the fundamental ideas of globalism, I think, are utterly exposed by the crisis. The notion that finance capitalism has all of the answers for the international economy, I think, is pretty much given the lie by this crisis. The idea that we're not going to have any depressions anymore, that the business cycle has been ironed out, that risk has been taken out of the system by means of derivatives, that financial capitalism is the form which the whole world will, more or less, under which the whole world will march, or I should say organize itself as a as a kind of a world order, a new world order, under these fundamental principles, which I think are more or less the old-time religion, according to the British political economy of the 1820s. That was said so quite frankly by the high priest Milton Friedman, that those principles were inviolate. Any deviation from that occurred at the end of the 19th century and in the era of the world wars, Milton Friedman said, any deviation from those ideas was misbegotten and turned out badly, and would have been much better. So the argument went, would have been much better if the world had never got away from the idea of laissez-faire capitalism as it was conceived of by the founders of British political economy in the 1820s. So this is quite an extremist bill of goods, in my opinion, was offered to the world under the aegis of globalism during the period of its heyday. I don't know that we're in the heyday anymore. I don't think it's necessarily disappeared from the scene. I'll elaborate on that next time. But at any rate, this is quite a series of very, very confident and not to say arrogant pronouncements made about, the laws of international economics. And I don't know, it seems to me that one can hardly maintain these things. Well, it's not I who says these things. It's the major financial journals and media. They are wondering about where they went wrong. Greenspan himself said the fundamental conception under which he organized the world, the fundamental idea under which he organized, in his mind, organized reality, was given the lie, was proved to be false. Well, that's the, how to put it, that's the state of mind that international economics is in today, and that conceptions of a new world order find themselves in today. Like people who have stopped believing in God, they haven't exactly found an alternative, and they don't know what to do next. Very understandable. And you can see this point of view expressed, in their various publications. So there we are. And what's revealed by 2008? What is finance capitalism? Well, the final analysis, finance capitalism is quantitative easing. It's quantitative easing. So the idea that they're going to absolutely deregulate workings of finance to the point where there is no real boundaries to anything that they can conceive as a product to sell to the world, and that this is somehow making the system stable. That idea disappears entirely, and really everyone in the final analysis is made whole and actually makes a killing, strictly speaking, makes a killing from this financial crisis because of quantitative easing. So what is quantitative easing? It's money printing. It's money printing. Well, the form it takes is that the central bank, in the United States case, the Federal Reserve, central bank buys up from big investment banks, big investors, the biggest investors, and not necessarily within national boundaries. Federal Reserve can do this for big European banks as well, and did. As a matter of fact, we know that now. It did do that. So it bails out the world economy and the people at the very top of the world economy by buying the bonds of their organizations, that is to say, lending the money. And it puts it on the Federal Reserve balance sheet, which goes into the many, many trillions now, goes up into the heavens. But this doesn't matter to anyone. And, the American president, Donald Trump, when he took office, speaking candidly on the few occasions when he actually did this with reporters, he said, oh, well, I don't worry about things like the national debt or anything like that. I don't worry about the Federal Reserve balance sheet. You can print the money. We can print the money. You're perfectly right. That is the approach. That is the regime, the rubric under which we are living today. If you ask what capitalism is today, or if you're on the left and you've been talking for many years about so-called late capitalism, the phrase I think of Ernest Mandel's originally, but one which was kicked around generally among leftist writers for quite some time. If you're thinking about late capitalism, you try to define it. What is it? It's finance capitalism, to be sure. That is to say, most of the money is made through various kinds of paper transactions, financial transactions, and not through the hiring of wage labor, the way Karl Marx thought of it, and not through the hiring of wage labor and the turning out of a product for a profit. No, that you make less money doing that. But by financial manipulations and maneuvers, that's where most of the money is made. It's like a world casino, Susan Strang said several decades ago, British economic writer, very sharp, very respected British economic writer. It's a casino, but it's a casino in which the big players, at any rate, they don't lose. So they get bailed out in the end. Money is printed. Where do the profits come from in this system based on profit? The government creates them. That's globalism. That's globalization. Well, think about the model of globalization and what we've been talking about through this whole course, people talking about what it all means. This is what it really means in practice. Because if it runs, it's not supposed to run into trouble, of course, but if it does run into trouble, this is how it fixes the trouble. It prints money. So where do they get their profits? The 1%, the tiny fraction of 1%, a handful of billionaires. Well, it isn't a handful now. It's getting to be quite a number. And in the world, and many billionaires. Where does their profit come from? Ultimately, in the end, it's printed. It's printed. Quantitative easing. So, quite an idea for the world to absorb, quite an exposure, I think I have to say. I don't think that most of the world, all right, here's another generalization a historian can make. I don't think that most of the world understood this properly before this time, before the crisis of 2008. I don't think anybody had heard the phrase. Apparently, the economist Richard Werner, whose film you're supposed to have watched about Japanese economic affairs, apparently he's the one who coined the phrase. But it's immediately taken up in the business press, and you see it everywhere now. Everybody knows what you mean when you say QE. I don't think before the crisis that most of the people in the world really understood this, what this was, that you could do this with money. In fact, I would venture to say that most of the people engaged in investments didn't know that you could do this. Let's generalize still further. I would say most of the readers of the business and financial press, now we're down to a fairly select group of people, did not understand this. Had to be explained to them. George Soros had to write an article in the Financial Times in which he explained carefully to the readers of the Financial Times on its editorial page what a credit default swap was and why there were so many trillions and trillions and trillions of them all over the world, why they represented such a time bomb, such a terrible, terrible threat, weapons of mass financial destruction, Warren Buffett called them, had to explain this. So this was not generally understood. And now you could say it is exposed to the public. So there's a general exposure. What would you say? It's the definition of financial capitalism, under the idea of QE. And then people are asking the question now, what is money and how is money created? That's another discourse that was never had, even in very, very sophisticated periodicals, sophisticated media, until very recently. The idea of actually explaining how money is created, how a bank creates money, fractional reserve banking. Look that phrase up. That was not generally understood. That you have to consider that part of the arcana of economic literature up until 2008. But after 2008, a lot of people started to argue it. There's even a school of thought, modern monetary theory, it's called, and it's very well known, well understood, and kind of almost legit. In fact, I would say it is legit. And it says, frankly, money is created out of nothing. It's the banks actually don't have money in the vault when they lend you money. They create the money. They create an account, and that's the money. And if you took it still further, that all this debt that we're talking about, and the world is swimming in debt, you could say the debt burden is just on everybody's shoulders. This is, in many ways, the money supply. I think it's Mariner Eccles, the chairman of the Fed under Roosevelt, who said that, but I'm not sure what the exact origin of this phrase is. But he said if you did away with all of the debt in the world, you wouldn't have any money. Well, this is not Econ 1A, such as, for example, a person like me was taught in his undergraduate days. I consider myself a pretty good student, actually. I got a very good grade in my first economics course, which laid out the basic patterns of these things. It did not touch on any of these matters. So this is quite an exposure in the whole world now, contemplating these things. And I think it's going down to the lowest levels. I think all of the people of the world are now getting a good look at the notion of quantitative easing, coming to the conclusion that, the whole world is running. Really, it's the lifeblood of the whole world. So in this graph, you see the Federal Reserve quantitative easing compared with the stock market, compared with the U.S. Shares of stock that are common stock that are sold, and it's the Standard & Poor 500. And as you can see, there's a very direct relationship. The printing of the money is what is creating the health of the stock market, and there it is. Also, there's something else connected with it. There's more Fed policy, more bank policy, and this is of the more conventional sort that Friedman talks about, and it stems from 19th century theories about banking that Friedman is very lucid about, and shows what all the central banks, the main central banks, did as a result of the crisis. So let's see if I can get my pointer happening here. Oh, here it is. Now here you see the series of interest rate increases that introduced the prelude to the big crash in 2008. So there's quite a number of them. And at the end of it, the British are doing the same thing, the Bank of England doing the same thing. Then when the crash happens, of course, the policy was to reduce the interest rates and to reduce them as low as you could get them, then to reduce them lower than that, and get to the point where they're practically in negative territory. Here's some negative territory down here where they're actually paying you to take their money. So it's the lowering of interest rates practically down to the 0 point. So just about everybody is part of this. And that's pretty much the regime we're living under, although we've had a little ripple of it, a little, how to put it, a taper. And that's the term that was invented to describe I don't want to call it dear money mood, but getting a little bit off quantitative easing, cutting down the quantitative easing and raising the interest rates. They're two different things, but they're related and often confused. And they're confused because they're very closely related. And they both mean easy money. But at any rate, there's a sort of a taper, and that's all prior to the COVID crisis of 2020, not shown on this graph. So there it is: quantitative easing, modern monetary theory. And you say, why do they get to print it? Does everybody in the world get to print it? Well, not exactly. Not exactly. Central banks, when they print their own money in this way, especially in this brazen way, are proclaiming their sovereignty, in the whole international currency system. So in a certain sense, they're acting like independent powers vis-a-vis each other, the only independent powers, but not everybody can do it. State of California can't do it. We have to cut the budget when things get tight around here. And our education budget suffers from it. So we, on the local level, we operate according to the old-time religion. On the higher level, though, they operate according to a seignorial conception of currency. So there's the seignorial dollar. You might even say the euro kind of pretends to that position. The yen to some degree, although the yen naturally keeps an eye on what everyone else is doing. And then you have all the lesser currencies, and of course the Chinese currency, the yuan, the one that really, you would think if things were based on the real economy, the yuan would be more important than all of the other currencies, kind of watchfully waiting for the moment when it can make its move and establish the change. But this is intimately related, as we have seen in spades in this course, intimately related with the general picture of how powerful the country is that stands behind this currency, because in the end, it is confidence, it is trust. For not by accident do we see that word trust appear, on our currency. In God we trust, such a bank will be called the trust company, Morgan Guarantee Trust. And, the idea of trust is basic. The idea of confidence is basic. And behind these presumed sovereign currencies lies a higher sovereignty, which is not exactly measurable in economic terms. So we've been preaching that throughout this course, and you should be well aware of this thought. And you should have been mulling it and applying it in various ways, or questioning it, whatever else you do with ideas that are not normally kicked around. All right, so all those things are exposed, and this notion that the United States plays this unique role in a world division of labor, an attempt to apply Ricardian economics to the present situation, and the idea that we're providing financial services, and that's our role in a world division of labor. That's sort of become a big joke, and it is given as a big joke in this very critical cartoon, which the real role the United States has. It's the biggest debtor in the world, and it's the biggest consumer, biggest consumer of goods. Does that mean everybody can do that? No. The United States can do that. So why can it do that? And this is not an economic answer that answers this question. As it applies in the U.S. economy, of course, the critics in the U.S. economy could say that, all we do is funnel money into this. So this is using a kind of a version of the old-time religion. You see people like, what's his name, who's on television a lot, I'm blanking on his name now, who always argues about deficits and debt, etc. And this is what the conservative parties in Parliament, Republican Party in the United States, what they argue when they don't want to pass a bill that's going to provide for some kind of expenditure. They start talking about the thing as if it were a grocery store, and we're trying to keep things in balance and all the rest of that. And not true, but anyhow, they try to argue that way. And so this is the way they look at the economy under the regime of money printing, which they connect to the old-time religion and the critique of the national debt, the critique of deficit spending, and all of the rest of that. It's questionable that a lot of people buy this anymore. That it's just because of profligacy that things have gone sour. What many people, I think of in terms of quantitative easing, in fact, is not an economic statement at all, but a kind of a social one, in that whatever it means for the history of economic thought, the fact is that it benefits a small number of people who come out of this thing. They come out of a huge crisis, not as they came out of the Great Depression, in which many of them were ruined. Nobody is ruined. In this thing, the people at the bottom are ruined, the people at the top are not. So life is good. Quantitative easing is good for those at the top. And then the question comes up, if it's simply arbitrary money printing and injection of liquidity into the banking sector, and it's based on the principle that the banking sector is crucial to the real economy, once it becomes obvious that it is not crucial, or at any rate that it's not doing anything to help the real economy, and it is only buying back its own shares on the stock market, so you get a jobless recovery. Once that becomes clear, the question emerges, well, this quantitative easing, is it necessarily bad? Can we use it? Can we use it to some other purpose, to back up a robust fiscal program? Well, that's happening now with the Biden administration. That is basically what's happening. Can we stimulate demand and investment and jobs and, well, even increase equality if we do it right with quantitative easing? That's a question. I haven't got the exact answer. History and life is providing this answer for us as we speak. We wonder how it's all going to shape up. But at any rate, the sacred principles of globalism don't seem to make much sense when we're speaking in these terms. Well, for one thing, the whole criticism of Keynes made by Milton Friedman, that doesn't seem to be so wise. Now that we look at it from the perspective of 2008, that doesn't seem to be so wise. And as a matter of fact, it doesn't have the same juice in the financial media that it used to have, that it had 20 or 25 years ago. Now, more often you read that Keynes is pretty much right. He's the man with the remedy. We have to get back to Keynes. And you don't see people saying, oh, Milton Friedman is perfectly right. It's absolutely correct about Keynes. Hayek is the one we have to look to for an answer to our current economic. No, you don't hear that so much. Confidence in that argument. And that's globalism. Confidence in that argument has, I think, evaporated. And nowadays, people don't like to put it in quite this way because it does seem to suggest that for the last 30, 40 years, we've been totally in the dark about this matter. And Keynes maybe was right. Milton Friedman, well, maybe was wrong. And ideas starting to seep in. And if you ask my opinion about it as a historian, of course, it's correct. I think that's correct. There's a, what's the word? There's a sobering up going on. There's been a big party. There's been a bacchanalian feast for which no one is sober. It's been going on for 40 years or so. Dionysiac orgy, you could argue, has been going on in the world of economics and finance. But now mornings come and you have to clean up the mess, and you have to start to sober up and reconsider some of the some of the some of the mistakes that were made, or maybe if you don't think of it, historians don't like to think of things so much in terms of mistakes, but maybe a path that led down a way that we didn't want to go. Perhaps we can't continue to go. That's the best way to put it. Perhaps we can't continue. And then the other idea that the Chinese, if anything, seem to have followed the thinking of Keynes on all of this. And they produced a fiscal stimulus of the most old-fashioned sort. They had a little dip, but they haven't suffered much. There's been a decoupling of the crisis of 2008. The East has not suffered nearly. It did not suffer the same depredations as the West. And the West suffered these depredations at the very bottom of the social scale. But what was the alternative? Was there an alternative? So I asked you to watch this film, Panic. I think very good film within its limitations. Very good film. Doesn't have anything about QE, so you get an entirely misbegotten conception of the whole logic of the thing. It promotes the thought that there was just a bailout by the federal government and the banks paid it back. Well, paid it back how? They did such spectacular business. Really, was it different business from the one that put them in the poorhouse in the first place? So this fantastic idea that they paid it all back. That is to say, an argument without quantitative easing as the main factor that made the whole thing work. All right, so the film does have that limitation, but it has a lot of good stuff, good history, and those are all original sources. Very good chronology, very good guide to the crisis, with that one exception. Very good, important exception, but very good guide to the crisis. Very interesting place in the movie. They have the meeting, you'll remember, when the Bush administration, which is going out of office and which is watching an election which Barack Obama is likely to win, actually doesn't want to take the final step for the bailout, which it has to absolutely impose on a recalcitrant, unhappy Congress, until it gets the parties together with the candidates who are likely to have to carry this whole business out, brings in John McCain for the Republicans and Barack Obama for the Democrats. And McCain's party, as has been pointed out up to that point in the film, McCain's party represents people who are very unhappy watching this thing and who resent this bailout for all the presumed losers in the casino. And Barack Obama's party, presumably the party on the left, Barack Obama's party has already settled the thing with Treasury Secretary Paulson and is 100% for the bailout. So the only critics of the bailout are the Republicans. People say, oh, this is the beginning. It comes from the Tea Party. This is the beginning of the Republican populism and et cetera, et cetera. That's not entirely, in my opinion, not entirely illuminating as to explain what's going on. Actually, I think McCain's in a position as the candidate where the ball's on his side of the net now, and he's got to hit it. But what's he going to do? He's going to come forward and say, well, we want to criticize this thing and it'll help us win the election. They're saying, oh, well, do you have an alternative? Obama is saying, we're for this bailout. You're a critic of the bailout. What do you say? And as the film demonstrates, this was a moment when McCain realized there was no alternative, or at any rate, no alternative he could think of. So there's the point. In fact, let's put it in larger terms because it's such a pretty good trigger, pretty good metaphor for understanding the whole problem of globalism. We can criticize globalism to beat the band, but when the moment comes, what's our alternative? Do we have another paradigm? You know, the great Kuhn, who wrote The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, about how scientific discovery happens, said, you know, criticism of the old paradigm, that destroys confidence in the old paradigm. But in the end, the paradigm cannot be discarded by mere criticism. No matter how badly it's doing, it, it cannot be discarded by mere criticism. The only thing that makes people discard a dominant paradigm is a new paradigm. So what's the new paradigm? McCain was asked, what do you have as an alternative if you are criticizing this bailout? What would the alternative have been? Well, how about the old-fashioned idea? Nationalize all the banks. That gives a lie to the idea that they have to be bailed out exactly as they are, and exactly as they are, they're making the economy work. And then it also suggests the idea that once you've nationalized them, you've got a scheme for making the economy work. That is to say, you know exactly how to direct and manage the investment that's necessary, and practically are taking over a socialist system. It's practically what it comes to. Oh, I'm sure McCain was not up to that. Certainly had never had that thought in his mind, not even when he's criticizing. But in other words, it's a fairly severe, even if it's a kind of an obvious step, but it's a fairly big departure. Well, to say the least, it's a big departure. So there isn't any alternative right on the agenda. And if I think there is an alternative, it's something that has to evolve over a period of time. You can't come up with it in one meeting, as McCain was asked to do. All right, so that's the United States situation. How does this affect the euro? So far we're talking about the dollar. In the euro, we have a kind of weakness in the eurozone that results from the crisis, and it's a fiscal crisis. We could go into a lot of detail about this, but perhaps it's not a good idea, and it would take us far afield to talk about the actual pluses and minuses of the fiscal crisis of the less well-endowed economies of the EU. Here we're thinking about Portugal, Italy, Ireland, Greece, Spain. So Southern Europe, peripheral Europe, you could say, and then Northern Europe in a rather different category, doing rather well with the euro. The Germans at the heart of the matter. The French, the Dutch. When I say these things, I'm really referring to German investors, French investors, Dutch investors, and some others. Northern European. So there's a rich Northern European part of the Eurozone and a poor Southern European part. Well, you would say if the Eurozone were really an integrated sovereign state, what difference would it make? We have rich states and poor states in the United States. If this were the United States of Europe, wouldn't matter. Wouldn't matter. The Eurozone would act like an economy, and it would absorb and support the exporters, the states that don't produce so much as the states that do. And that's certainly the case in the United States. There's a difference. Some states get a lot more services for the taxes they pay. Some get a lot less. And that's going to happen with an agglomeration of states. So here's a big agglomeration of states. If it were really one country, the way it likes to pretend or thinks it's on the road to being, this would be a fairly easy thing to accommodate. It's the sort of thing that Varoufakis likes to reference. This is the world he would like to see in Europe. He would like to see the Europeans acting like a real nation state and taking care of the South. But that's not the way. That's not the way it acted as a result of this crisis, even with all of the quantitative easing. That is to say, the euro was exposed as much as the dollar was in terms of the ideology backing up globalism. But the Europeans stuck to the old-time religion since the United States, and they called in support for the weaker countries. So the main case was Greece. That's the one that prompts the extraordinary career of Varoufakis and his great interest for those who read about the thing today. And in return for this support, it demanded a terrible, terrible package of, of, of prescriptions, conditionalities for bailing out Greece. And then what the Greeks got for this bailout had to be paid off to the big banks who were their debtors. And it turns out these big banks are the Deutsche Bank and a couple of other big French banks too. So in effect, the Eurozone is bailing out the banks through the Greeks. And that's the situation. So this strikes many, many Europeans, many naive Europeans, I think we can say, as being very, very corrupt and making the Eurozone and making the EU look very, very bad. Not what all of the small countries who, cling to the Eurozone, cling to the Euro, not making them very, very happy. And in fact, I mean, you could put it more strongly than that. Varoufakis probably would put it exactly that way, or maybe even more strongly than I have been putting it, that the Eurozone now appears to be a cruel committee of central bankers, just like the people who ran the gold standard in the 19th century, who are whipping, as this Ingram Pin Financial Times cartoon has it, they are whipping all of the peoples of Europe, and many of the peoples of Europe are, realize they're under a terrible tyranny which is chewing them up. You see the wheel is rolling over the people, and many among them are starting to say, no more euro, the euro is a prison. Well, it's like the gold standard in the 19th century. One has to obey the discipline, the fiscal and monetary discipline of the system, and so that the Northern European members of the euro, it's only basically a customs union, but it happens to have that united currency, that one currency, and they are the ones who are wielding the whip. And of course, the main one is Germany. So there's a way of putting this, which says it is the Germans who are running Europe, capitalistically speaking, and who are exploiting the rest of the Europeans, who think they need them. But in reality, the Germans really crack the whip and are making all of the rest of Europe poor. If Hitler were alive, one might think he would smile and he would say that there was some kind of inexorable logic of some racial superiority or some such argument. These are the things that are kicked around on the far right, even on the far left in Europe these days, and they are part of the problem of the exposure, as I've been putting it, the exposure of globalism that's given by this crisis. And what comes up in its place is a sense that, even if we haven't got an alternative to globalism, and even if we haven't exactly conceptualized the whole thing on an international scale, we can at least go back to our old-fashioned nationalist reflexes. So here's a cartoon that comes from the French right, and it kind of goes a long way with the idea of French globalism. I think the French are sticking up for the Germans more than any other country. So great hope in French nationalism, perhaps an exaggerated hope in French nationalism is suggested by this cartoon. The cartoon obviously points to the candidacy of some nationalist, how to put it, General Boulanger, Bonaparte, whoever, Le Pen, whoever that's going to be. And, we live in the era of pre-Le Pen. We have the feeling the next election in France is going to bring Le Pen and the right to power. This is an attempt to state their case, or what the cartoonist hopes their case will be, that they will really break with globalism. The French are too embedded, in my opinion, too embedded with globalism, too wed to the idea of Franco-German amity to contemplate what this cartoon is suggesting. But the nationalist impulse is there. It's obviously there in all of the small countries in Europe, and it comes out sharply when you see some of them revolting against some of the ideas of neoliberalism about how to organize their economies and how to organize their polities. So you see this in Poland, you see this in Hungary. There's Viktor Orban, speaking for Hungary now. And the Hungarians, they are sticking up for the Chinese more than anybody else in Europe. The Chinese are building railways in Hungary, railways in Serbia as well. This is how to put it, the break with globalism. Where does it all point? The break with globalism points toward the Chinese model and the Chinese influence, which is more important than their model. The Chinese influence, the Chinese ability to take the place of the financial institutions of globalism, the IMF and the World Bank. So that's a powerful tendency that takes shape, and I call this the revenge of the state, an international model. Now, globalists and who are critics of any kind of quarrel with globalism, they call this illiberal, as good a term as any. Ian Bremmer talks about state capitalism. There are a number of ways of describing this. Nationalism, populism, you often see. A lot of this is imprecise because the terminology is a mess, and nobody has agreed exactly how to put this, how to understand this thing terminologically. Anyhow, everybody sees it happening. It's a revolt against globalism. In fact, globalism is kind of revolting against it as much as it is revolting against globalism. So Putin represents, Putin's Russia represents kind of the centerpiece in this. And we haven't said very much about Putin's Russia, but we could have noted or should have noted that they've taken control of all their national security sectors of the economy. They've especially taken control of their natural resources and their oil. So they become a big petrostate, and that's under national control, either through nationalized firms or some firms that are what you might call national champions, like Lukoil, for example. Now, it's private, but it's favored and subsidized and helped out in various ways by the government. There are various firms, Russian firms like that. So Ian Bremmer describing this as a kind of state capitalism, not a good term, but it's a term. And we know what he's talking about. He compares this to what the Chinese are doing. This is part of the idea that China has become capitalist somehow. And I would say that all of this is entirely feasible and thinkable in terms of the statism of the dictatorship of the proletariat, of socialism, of Marxism, which I think the Chinese still buy and still march under. But anyhow, you can't say that about the Russians and Putin. They have put paid to the Russian Revolution. They don't exactly know why, but they know they're not going down this road anymore. And but they still have very considerable, how to put it, statist institutions. So that's what we see, a revenge of nationalism and statist institutions against globalism, and a very conscious critique, ideologically, critique of globalism. So there are implications to that critique. We haven't seen all the implications shape up. That'll be an interesting thing for the next 10 years, to watch all the implications of this presumed nationalist revolt against globalism. But we know its general features, sovereign wealth funds. So instead of recycling all this money to the West, they gather it in their own sovereign wealth fund. Their sovereign wealth engages in investment, and as a matter of fact, starts to act like a globalist itself, starts to invest in projects abroad and things like that. So Chinese have a massive sovereign investment fund, and they're all over the place. Tremendous money in the world now, concentrating in these sovereign wealth funds. And the sovereign wealth funds are not exactly part of the globalist system. Well, they are in a way, but in many ways they're out of the control of the globalist system, and they could serve as a basis for almost any kind of economic reorganization of the world that their parent countries might contemplate. And that's what is so worrisome to a writer like Ian Bremmer, for example, who's written about this, in my opinion, very lucidly. So there's a kind of neo-mercantilism, you're going to kind of manage your trade so that it benefits the state. And the phrase that Bremer uses is state capitalism. Good, not a good term to describe both China and Russia as state capitalists. That's a very murky term. But anyhow, that's the one he uses, and we know what he's talking about. And national sovereign wealth funds, national champions, resource nationalism, you might call it, when you think about the action of the petrostates, for example. This is a new model for the world, a kind of a national autarky, you might even say, model, which harks back to the 30s. We'll think about the Great Depression and how the world was breaking down into economic blocks, and how the whole idea of autarky was praised, and the fascist powers were describing a world reorganized according to this scheme of a pluralist series of economic blocks, which might somehow make common cause, but not on the basis of market economy, not on the basis of Ricardian division of labor, or any conception of international economics. In fact, they all denounced economics and thought it was wicked, and said there were no rules to it. The state determines everything, they argued. Okay, so we have Putinism in Russia, I guess the most outstanding example of this. Putinism controls the oligarchs. Here you see them in a meeting with Putin. And in these meetings, he kind of sardonically and jokingly tells them everything he wants them to do. And they say, "Splendid, boss." They act as if it's a board, and with a very powerful chairman of the board who's laying down the law, and he definitely lays down the law on a whole string of things. He's practically a socialist when it comes to certain things that have to do with the rights of some of the poor people who have to live in this economy. And often he dictates in a very populistic way, I guess you could say, to these oligarchs. And of course, the condition is that if they do absolutely everything he says and don't make him angry, that he treats them well and lets them get as rich as they want. It's exactly the model that Werner Sombart, the great German economist, used to describe the situation of the German bourgeoisie in the Kaiser's Germany before World War I. The biggest bourgeoisie got to make all the money it wanted. The government freed it and supported it, but it could not mess around in politics, not in the slightest. And any kind of deviation was definitely frowned upon. So that's the model that Sombart talked about for Imperial Germany. It's exactly the model that applies in Putin's Russia with the oligarchs. All right. Should we, by the way, fight Russia because of this? This difference in the economic models, is it enough for us to fight over? In other words, should we have a bad political relationship with them on account of this model? That's a question that all of us ought to ponder. I would say let's think that one over before you get into a fighting mood with the Russians, and think about broader things that have to do with national interest other than this difference in economic models. All right, then we have the other problem that we're dealing with, and this comes out of a fundamental hostility toward the Russian model, but also there's a problem of a geopolitical sense that Russia should not get too strong on the world island, and that Europe needs to block it in some way. There's no way to block it anymore, and especially if the Russians get along with Germany. So that's the pattern. Prior to World War II, back in the 19th century, that's the prevailing pattern. The Russians and the Germans, the Bismarck tradition in Germany, and the Russians more or less went along with it. Prince Gorchakov and others went along with it in the 19th century, that you can't be on the wrong side of Germany, and Germans, you can't be on the wrong side of Russia. So we see this today, not the Nazi-Soviet pact, although that's one example of this fundamental geopolitical reality between Germany and Russia. It's a part of that, but that's not the point. The Nazi Soviet, but this is not a continuation of the Nazi Soviet pact, but it's just a natural connection of Russia and Germany. And here they connect over gas. So Russia's a big gas supplier to Europe. Europe needs Russian gas. It's got to go according to a pipeline. The Nord Stream pipelines 1 and 2. Number 2, just on the verge of completion as we speak. Definitely bypassing Poland and making transit through Poland, as you can see, according to this map. This map actually does illustrate this point in a simple and lucid way. Not just transit through Poland, but some other places, transit through other places, and they would get transit fees for that. So they don't like this idea of a direct pipeline between Germany and Russia. But what are they going to, the Poles, what are they going to do about it? Well, one of the things they have done about it is a 3 Cs initiative to try to organize all the states in East Central Europe. It's a hell of a project because these people do not have very much in common and have no common history to speak of. And quite the reverse. They've been fighting more than they've been friendly with one another. And they don't have a great history, an enormous history, as much as the other European states as having lived as states for very long. But anyhow, they're supposed to be organized, and all by Poland, pretty much, into the 3 Cs initiative, which is going to connect the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea through rail links, Autobahn, pipelines, things of that sort. Presumably, the United States will provide, or somebody else will provide, not somebody other than the Russians, will provide natural gas to them. It'll be an alternative and a way of breaking up the German-Russian relationship. So you can see the geopolitical suggestions, the geopolitical implications of the whole thing that is indicated here. So as we speak, there's this still a tremendous effort to keep the Germans from completing this pipeline, but they're going to do it anyhow. So that tells you something about Germany. By the way, it also tells you something about Germany and France. The Franco-German amity is the basis of the Euro, of the Eurozone, of the European Union. And so this German connection with Russia has to be with France too. France, Germany, Russia. This is the Kaunitz coalition. Those of you who are diplomatic history buffs, back in the middle of the 18th century, Count Kaunitz ended up cooking up a coalition like this. Anyhow, this is a fundamental thing that is happening that thwarts, I think, any conceptions that the United States is going to dictate to Europe. So these are going to be the questions we're going to be discussing and maybe even quarreling over in the future with regard to U.S.-European relationship. I think it's a fundamental issue. And what's implicit in it is this broad notion that there's an ideological suggestion of a Polish national destiny and all these machinations in East Central Europe, and the idea that the Poles are perhaps the natural people around which to organize some kind of cultural and maybe more than that at some point grouping or possible state in the future between the 2 Cs, the intermarium between the Baltic and the Black Sea. So that's the old Polish idea of Poland from sea to sea. And Poland actually was pretty much, according to this map, roughly, very roughly, some exceptions, no Crimea, but some exceptions, way back in the 17th and 18th centuries. So maybe the Poles still think in, some Polish nationalists think in these terms. Nationalists have to think in terms of these broad historical generalizations because they're the basis of ideology. And then the other example of the revolt against imperialism, of course, is China. Now, everybody thought Chinese were the best imperialists, and that's the thing we have to note about it, that the Chinese have been thought of as part of globalization. Indeed, maybe the most important part of globalization, and they're so integral. And, you know, we've given our market to them. The United States given our market to the Chinese products. We're all wearing stuff on our backs right now, made in China, and consume Chinese products everywhere in our economy. And the thought that went along with this surrender of the U.S. market over many decades of the heyday of globalism was that the Chinese were going to become capitalists. So that its inevitable tendency, this hookup with the world economy, suggests a trend toward capitalism. And the Chinese fed this idea in our minds, fed this idea with various pronouncements, most of which have turned out to be worthless. This has not happened. They're not going really toward capitalism. In fact, you make the argument that they have made all along, that none of the things that they changed in China, none of the concessions to private enterprise in China mean anything in terms of the general definition of the society as a socialist regime. Dictatorship of the proletariat, according to the thinking of Karl Marx. So that began to become pretty clear when Xi Jinping came to power. Not so clear under the previous leaders, not so clear under Jiang Zemin. Certainly not clear under Deng Xiaoping. Although you can look for the statements those gentlemen made, and you could say that they never made it out that they were becoming completely capitalist. Or at any rate, that they had deserted, put it differently, that they had deserted the dictatorship of the proletariat. And so Xi Jinping has been a little bit more upfront about that, and now the discovery has dawned in the West that, gee, if they're not going to become capitalists, look how big and powerful they've got from globalization. As a matter of fact, they practically own globalization the way we've set it up. We've practically set it up for them to run the world. I mean, this is something that can be argued and practically has been argued. And if we did set it up that way, how can we unset it? That's the present dilemma in U.S. policy, dealing with China. Not an easy answer to this. And the Chinese have some cards to play on this enormous world historical scale here. So there is the Chinese projection, that's all it is, projection of some kind of economic and who knows, political unity. It'll have to come a long, long time from now, a time when they bring Brazil into a common block of cooperation with China. The Chinese will have to be a big naval power by that time, and who knows what will develop or what even moves Brazil in this direction. But the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, it's only a phrase that an investment advisor on Wall Street, Jim McNeil, only a phrase he used, but they snatched at it, and before you knew it, they're having BRICS conferences and BRICS meetings, and etc. And it's an idea that maybe we'll have who knows, maybe we'll have a future. Then there's also the Belt and Road initiatives, both in their maritime and rail projections. And as you see, they would certainly unite Eurasia in a way it's never been united before if they are brought through to their conclusion. And the Russians have some interest in bringing them to their conclusion, especially as we're unpleasant to the Russians. The more unpleasant we are to the Russians and to Putin, the more the Russians are induced to play ball with the Chinese in establishing this Belt and Road system, which really has the promise, or some people call it a threat, of organizing all of Eurasia and organizing it in a way that make it the center of the world economy and world polity. So that is a big, big thing. And there isn't much behind it. Chinese don't have any kind of successor to the Warsaw Pact, and the Chinese weren't in the Warsaw Pact anyhow. but don't have a common union of communist states or something like that. No, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which still continues to have its meetings, it only brings together Russia and China, basically, and Kazakhstan is, when Russia and China agree, Kazakhstan agrees, and the Indians don't want to be separated from it, so they're there, and the Pakistanis sort of feel the same way, so they're there, and so it ends up, if you only think of it the way we're thinking of it, and it's a little vague. In fact, it has to be vague. It's not a military alliance, although it has a lot of, it does military talks, what would have been called staff talks. Um, and they participate in some military exercises. So the idea is contemplated that this could be some kind of military alliance someday in the future, some different day from our day. Um, but anyhow, there it is. And on the map, it looks quite formidable. It looks like all of Eurasia. It's being organized by the Chinese. The main thing the Chinese want to do, of course, is to provide, at this point, an alternative to the dollar. So that's another thing that comes out of 2008, this notion that the seignorial currency is backed up by not much, by money printing. And this constitutes a terrific argument that the Chinese can make for an alternative to the dollar, if only it could be had. So it is intimately involved, as we've seen, with the political power of the Chinese state. So you can't just say it'll be easy as pie for them to do this, but that's what they want to do. And one of these days, they may find a way to do it. They're making, as we speak, making a number of attempts to establish some kind of gold backing for the yuan. And already a certain amount of Russian-China trade is done without the dollar. That's the whole thing, doing things without the dollar. And there's a certain amount of other trade in the world that's being done without the dollar, but most of the trade in the world is done under the sovereignty of the dollar. The United States defends this sovereignty in the most, how to put it, the most reflexive way. It's a gut feeling, the United States, that if it loses on this dollar front, it's going to lose everything. So this will be the fundamental question for the future that has to do with globalism. Some would say the one central question that globalism still has to deal with. And then there's a question which is a little bit subsidiary to this, but it has to do with the so-called pink tide, various leftist regimes, a whole string of them in Latin America. Unfortunately, we haven't got time to go into all of this fascinating stuff, the tide of the left in Latin America, but it is not unopposed at all. There's a tremendous tide goes back against them. And a number of the people that you see in this picture, no longer on the scene, have been removed one way or another. So there's been a tremendous tide against them. We can't go into detail. It becomes Latin American history rather than global history. There's this interesting little wrinkle to it, though, and it has to do with the question of the domestic models that these countries pursue. And really, that's the thing that everybody's fighting over. The United States does not want them to pursue a social democratic model. Does not. It might have been for this during the Cold War if it thought it had helped against communism. But now there's no communism anymore, so it doesn't want even social democracy. And so there's a feeling that the United States has to fight this social democracy, but fight it with what? And in Bolivia, there has emerged, although it's failed just slightly, but there's emerged a little glimmer of an ideological alternative there in these fundamentalist regimes. And here we see a kind of parallel with the United States and the United States right dependency on Christian fundamentalism. There has emerged a kind of ideology which was directed against Evo Morales and the movement toward socialism in Bolivia as being a movement of the indigenous and an ideology of Christianity organized against this movement. It's an interesting wrinkle from the standpoint of neo-fascism, a kind of Christian fundamentalism organized militantly against all secular tendencies. So this would be parallel to the the way the fascists in Europe felt about the Enlightenment and all of Freemasonry and all the rest of that stuff that represented the ideas of the French Revolution, kind of general opposition to everything that's modern, in the name of everything in Europe that's traditional and tribal, which would mean Christian, as they see it, for the European right-wingers, that we have a Latin version of that. Has that got a chance in Catholic countries? It runs against Catholicism, you would think. So these are things we don't know, and but they're kind of troubling ideas that have popped up on the ideological front in Latin America. Which of these alternatives would be most congenial to the United States? Just as a footnote, we might ask that question. I hope the United States would not take the view that it wants to see a fundamentalist, Pentecostal, right-wing, neo-fascist, anti-indigenous, anti-Catholic politics on the right in Latin America on a large scale. I can't see that would be in the interest of the United States. There is something of a debate, a mini debate about this that has come up in the United States. Maybe it'll turn into a real debate. But I can't see the American interest in promoting anything so wild on the right. Only if the right gets very, very crazy. And this is not unthinkable. Will these things start to make sense to it in its great struggle against everything that's reasonable and wholesome in the social democracy? Anyhow, that's my thought on the matter. And I guess all of this comes under the heading of the U.S. fighting to retain what many people in the south of the planet think of as its unfair advantages over them, and the inordinate pretensions of the globalist ideology and the inequality it creates around the globe. Things you've heard a lot and which you see represented in various protest movements, which we haven't given proper attention to. But it does come out in a kind of series of actions that the United States is making in the name of globalism and against its presumed opponents, a kind of a sanctions regime. And it has singled out a number of countries: Russia, China, North Korea, Cuba, since the beginning of the revolution, for very and Venezuela not shown on this map, for very punishing sanctions. So you could argue this is kind of a non-global, anti-global, or sub rosa global regime of sanctions. Mostly it keeps out the important things that these countries need to get by on. In some cases it means medicines. It's not good. And it creates a lot of antagonism, hatred, and everything, but there's a feeling that it intimidates and serves U.S. policy in some way. I think does the opposite. A sanctions regime for a stronger country generally promotes a spirit of autarky, which cuts against any kind of conceptions of globalism. So cuts against, makes an enemy out of the country. And eventually that country is fully capable, as the Russians have proved recently, that you get completely free of other contacts. Autarky still can be achieved by some countries. Some others, no. Okay, so they really have to suffer under a sanctions regime. But I don't think this wins the admiration of the world. So there we have it, a worldwide series of measures taken on behalf of the dollar, on behalf of globalization. And in the end, maybe a foreign policy of confronting Russia and China. We won't take this up today. Maybe I'll take it up next time when I sum things up. Foreign policy that leads toward antagonism and perhaps promotes war, and which raises the general question. I'll maybe go into this at some greater length next time, that this dollar regime, if in the end it is the only thing that is holding up the world economy, and if it can only be held up by US power as a kind of sovereign entity, maybe has to be backed up by a regime that's so muscular and maybe amounts even to being a big bully in world affairs, that it encounters enormous opposition, and that those who oppose it are not without resources. So the question emerges then, should the United States try to accommodate them, or can it continue to press globalism in an aggressive way, and to court the possibility of war? Or reconsider the utility of war. That is to say, get itself into a position of trying to influence and deter the opponents of globalization, such as the Russians and the Chinese, to the degree that it practically leaves them no choice, being what they are, whatever it is they are. It practically leaves them no choice than to fight back. And that the United States really can't get its way any other way than by war. Is that the logic of globalism? Is globalism is it a worldwide tendency which is untenable, which is originally sold as something everybody in the world wants and needs, if they're only sensible, and which may turn out to be something that has to be imposed on the world against its will by war? Would you say the same thing about the English globalism of the 19th century? That it was a system that could only be imposed on the whole world by means of the balance of power, and the balance of power means war. That is to say, it means coalition war against any threatened, or I should say any threatening power. So that's the question it's a question left us by history, and Friedman seems to grasp this, although he doesn't want to spell it all out, but it seems to be the direction of the logic of the argument of the book you're reading this semester. That's quite a question. Maybe I'll say a little bit more about that next time. Let me finish by trying to characterize this whole history we've been talking about this semester, at least in terms of the enormous, almost demonic energy of profit making in the United States, among the United States elites and among other elites around the Atlantic, and maybe on a trilateral basis, considering China and the Far East, or I should say Japan and the Far East. It's enormous energy. It spills over into almost a purely speculative energy, and which breaks every bond, sorry, breaks every bond that it confronts, that washes over every obstacle to the ends of the earth. An enormous, how to put it, not exactly a rational or planned thing, but you could call it creative destruction, Dionysiac energy, a wave of passions that gushes forth over the entire globe with no limit in sight. No limit. Doesn't know limits, really hates limits, and that somehow statecraft, rationality can follow behind it and figure out a way for it to get its way, for it to succeed despite everything. If it creates enemies, to confront those enemies. If it raises resistance and obstacles, to overcome that resistance. Okay. That's the point. Maybe I'll try to elaborate on this slightly next time. But if we imagine this world which is just created for a very few people, out of this enormous expansion, an end to which is not foreseen. This is a system that has to expand. We have to also ask the question, before we even contemplate this business about war, which I will talk a little bit more next time, whether the system itself won't crash again. Because 2008 showed that these things, there's no reason why these things don't happen. The economic basis is not a basis for world stability. Far from it. It has to be patched up by the moral hazard of backing up the winners in the casino, or I should say, making the losers into the winners, put it better. And it crashed just out of the blue, presumably. Is it going to crash again? Has there been any new foundation been put under it that promises that these crashes have been abolished? And I think the answer is no. What if we have another crash? So I haven't got a proper answer to that question, although maybe one can speculate. And historians are not supposed to speculate, but this kind of history, we practically have to, except we've run out of time for this speculation. Maybe next time, in my summing up, I'll talk about these things, and we'll consider some kind of, thoughts out of season. It would be thoughts out of season for a world historian. They would not be historical thoughts, but they'd be thoughts about the future based on history. Something historians actually don't like to do, but we're more or less forced to do it. So maybe I'll do some of that next time. And you'll be writing a final as well. So I'll see you on Thursday at any rate. We'll talk about what I should put on this final for you. And you can make your suggestions then. Okay, so see you on Thursday.